praise team. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. While I was preparing the message, I remember an experience of mine when I was still in high school. I was in my junior year, hindi pa K-12 that time. I was in my junior year when I joined the Citizen Army training. Of course, I think I just had half of my body this time. I was as small as that before. So I joined the Citizen Army training in our school. And this training was something that those who were aspiring to become an officer would go through. So I joined, and then at the end of the training, I was given a rank na major. And I served as the adjutant dun sa school namin. On the following year, the high officials who were ahead of me, the senior ones, already graduated. And so, after which, they asked me, we would like to appoint you as the battalion commander this time. And because you already had gone through the training last year, those individuals who will be going through the training this year, we would like you to handle them. And you take charge of the training. And I accepted the challenge, so I handled the training. There was one time when one of the cadets did not really follow what was expected from them. So while the training was going on, there were a lot of students standing as an audience surrounding the basketball court. And what I did was I brought this cadet in the middle of the basketball court, and I told them, you sit on the air for 30 minutes with a rifle on your hands. Doing like this for 2 minutes is quite okay. I think you could still manage it. But 30 minutes, it's a crazy thing. And so while I was there, I was observing him. I was just counting the time. And I was also looking at the audience around me. And after around 10 minutes, I think, I saw his hands and legs shaking. And I really would like to hear the words, I would give up from him. But he did not give up. He just continued with it, even if he was shaking already. And then there was something that needed my attention. So I told the cadet, you stay where you are and continue doing what I asked you to do. You still have around 20 minutes remaining. I will come back. So I left. Around maybe 10 steps or 15 steps away, I stumbled upon a stone. I almost fell on the ground and dropped my face at a poo of a carabao. And when that happened, I heard this comment from the crowd, which I wasn't able to identify who that particular person is. When that happened to me, you know what one of the persons in the crowd said? Da gabaan. When I heard that line, it's only then that I thought in his mind I was doing so evil and cruel thing in this cadet. And that's a reality, a tendency for many of us, if not for all of us. When we see someone hurting another, we also would like bad things to happen to that person. I related to you before when my little girl was just around 3. She was running around and she stumbled on a small ball, basketball. And what happened was she stumbled on it and she got hurt and she cried. And you know what we adults usually do, right? When a child stumbles upon something and she cries, we go to the child and carry the child. Oh, what happened to you? And the child would say, I got stumbled because of that ball. And then this is one thing that I have observed. I think it was the grandma. I don't know if the grandma is here. The grandmother went to my child and said, okay, don't worry, I'm going to kick the ball. And she kicked the ball and she told my little girl, stop crying now. I already kicked the ball. When I heard and saw that, I said, this is a crazy thing because you are teaching revenge to the child. We just don't realize that, but it's a concept of revenge. Why? That when you hurt someone that hurt the child, that somehow would give us or a relief to her. But that's not a reality actually. What if it was not a ball? What if it was another child? So kung napandol ba ang imong anak because of another child, you will go and hurt that child na kung saan natalisod yung anak mo? I think we would not like the idea. But human as we are inclined to doing that and feeling the same. That when someone hurts us, there is a desire inside us to also see that person suffer. It's a reality that we can observe. Maybe if not within you, you would observe that around you. That when you hurt the person, that person would somehow think that, I hope you would be hurt also. The same thing happened to the prophet of God. We would be discussing the 4th chapter of Jonah. Okay? This is the last chapter of the book. And we will discover here that Jonah himself had gone through similar thing that we often experience in life. Wanting to hurt people who hurt us or did evil to other people surrounding. So let us look at Jonah chapter 4. I'll read the whole chapter because it's not just very long. It's just composed of 11 verses. It says here from the NASB, "But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, 'Please, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity. Therefore, now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life.' The Lord said, 'Do you have a good reason to be angry?' Then Jonah went out from the city and sat east of it. There he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen in the city. So the Lord God appointed a plant, and it grew up over Jonah to be a shade over his head, to deliver him from the discomfort. And Jonah was extremely happy about the plant. But God appointed a worm when dawn came the next day, and it attacked the plant, and it withered. When the sun came up, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint and begged with all his soul to die, saying, 'Death is better to me than life.' Then God said to Jonah, 'Do you have a good reason to be angry about the plant?' And he said, 'I have good reason to be angry even to death.' Then the Lord said, 'You had compassion on the plant for which you did not work and which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know the difference between their right and left hand, as well as many animals?'" May the good Lord bless the reading of His Word. For us to understand clearly what Jonah intended for his readers to get out of this text, we would be navigating within this chapter through these three subdivisions, verses 1 to 5, which I put there a subtitle, "A Disappointment Out of a Bad Expectation," and then go to verses 6 to 8, "A Display of Sovereignty in Response to a Stubborn Reaction," and then verses 9 to 11, "A Great Lesson Acquired and Learned in a Tough Situation." So we would be navigating all throughout the chapter with these three subdivisions. The first one, a disappointment out of a bad expectation. What was Jonah expecting? We would understand more verses 1 to 5 if we know what happened in chapter 3. What happened in chapter 3 was this. We discussed this last Sunday. Jonah was discouraged by the great sea creature near Nineveh, and he walked to the city. And when he arrived at the city, he began preaching to them a message of doom. What was that message? As I have mentioned to you last Sunday, one of the shortest preaching I have ever heard and read in my life. He said 40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown. And that's all. And he kept on reiterating the same message all throughout the city. And when the inhabitants of Nineveh heard that message, surprisingly, they repented. They left their evil doings. They approached God with sackcloth on their body and ashes on their head. So they really felt remorse and asked for forgiveness before God. And at the end of that chapter, chapter 3, you would see that God withdrawn His judgment to Nineveh. And because God withdrew His judgment to Nineveh, this disappointed Jonah. That is why when you look at verse 1 of chapter 4, the writer tells there, but it greatly displeased Jonah and he became angry. Don't get me wrong here. Jonah was not angry with God. He was angry with the decision of God. Because what he desired in his heart contradicted the very will of God. What was his desire? He wanted the Ninevites to experience the judgment, the wrath of the Almighty, that they would all be vanished from this earth. That's what he wanted to happen. But the will of God was the opposite of it. He wanted judgment, and yet God forgave them. That is why verse 1 tells us, Jonah is greatly displeased, and he became angry. And out of this decision of the Lord, out of his anger, he told the Lord and revealed to him his reason why he fled to Tarshish earlier in chapter 1, right? God told him, you go to Nineveh. Remember the map last Sunday that I have showed you? Nineveh is on the northern part of Israel only. And then Tarshish is in the opposite side of it. And in fact, Tarshish is farther than Nineveh from Israel. But he really decided to run away far from the Lord's presence because he did not understand that God is everywhere maybe, or he was just so disappointed. And so he tried to fled from the presence of God and disobeyed the Lord. And at that time, he did not reveal to God verbally, though God knew it because God saw it in his heart. This time, he revealed to the Lord, sabi niya sa verse 2, this is the reason why. Please, Lord, was not this what I said while I was still in my country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God. Because Jonah did not like that God would just forgive the Ninevites. God told Jonah, you announce this because I am going to give them this punishment. I'm going to judge them. And Jonah didn't like to go there because there was a possibility that when he announces the sermon that God gave him, the people would repent and God would not judge them anymore. As I have told you last time, Jonah maybe was one of those Israelites who experienced firsthand the cruelty of the Assyrians. And to those of you who were not here last Sunday, if you look at the map, Israel is somewhere here, and you move further north, you would see Nineveh. And Jonah was living in the northern part of Israel. So if the Assyrians would attack Israel, the first place that would suffer the cruelty of the Assyrians was those occupying the northern part of Israel, in which one of those people was Jonah. And often the Assyrians, when they attack a place, as I have told you last Sunday, they would loot your belongings, they would get what belonged to you, and not only that, but they would get your young men and even children, the male children, so that they could turn them to soldiers of the empire. That's what they would do. And worse than that, when they would see women that they like, ladies and women that they would like, they would rape them. So there is a possibility that there were even relatives that Jonah's relatives that were raped, Jonah's relatives that were taken away from them, and probably the belongings of his family were taken away from them. So because of those experiences, Jonah really didn't like to preach to the Ninevites because they might repent. And that possibility happened in chapter 3. Now in chapter 4, he's telling God, this is the very reason why I fled. This is the very reason why I didn't like to come here. Why are you withdrawing your judgment from them? So Jonah was so disappointed. So disappointed. And out of this disappointment, God asked him a question in verse 4. Do you have a good reason to be angry? And Jonah's response, it was really, you would be able to say that at the height of his anger. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 says, Then Jonah went out from the city and sat east of it. There he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen in the city. Jonah, out of his anger, expressed to the Lord what he did before and the reason for doing so. And God responded to him, "Do you have the reason to be angry?" And he was really so angry that he left the city. So if this is, Mr. Operator, can I go to that place without creating a feedback? If this is Nineveh, Jonah left the city. He went far from it because he wanted to see how God is going to judge the city. And to think about it, it happened already after God told him, "I am not going to judge the city because the people already repented." And after hearing that, after God asking him, "Is there a reason for you to be angry?" And so he went away, went out of the city, and then built a shelter from a distance where he could still see the city of Nineveh. And there he sat, waiting for the judgment of God to happen. Imagine, sinabi na ni Lord, "I am not going to judge Nineveh. I am not going to erase them from the face of this planet." But Jonah did not believe that because he might be thinking, probably God is going to change his mind. Probably God will still give the judgment. Or probably, even if the Ninevites repented already, probably the repentance that happened will just take for a very short time, maybe just for a day. They would be very sorry for their sins, that they would be honoring God, that they would be bowing down before Him. But probably on the following day, they will just go back to their old doings. So I'm going to wait here. I want to see how God is going to destroy this city. I want to see how these people will die. And he built a shelter there. It was not nighttime yet. He was there. And for what? To wait for the judgment to come. So out of that disappointment, God saw Jonah so stubborn and wanting the judgment to be released, and yet God really withheld it from the Ninevites. So this is the kind of idea that the writer is trying to portray to us in verses 1 to 5. His disappointment out of a bad expectation. He was disappointed because what he was expecting did not really happen. Isn't it also a reality in our life that from time to time, what we desire in our hearts would not happen because actually what we desire is not according to God's will? Or sometimes it's even against God's will. A very concrete example is that when you are a married person, you desire for another woman, definitely that desire is against God's will. So His will is going to disappoint you. Okay? So there are really times that we desire for something that is against God's will, and Jonah this time had that experience. Now we'll proceed to the next division of this chapter, a display of sovereignty in response to a stubborn reaction. Let us look at verse 6. So the Lord God appointed a plant, and it grew up over Jonah to be shade over his head to deliver him from his discomfort. Now here comes the word appointed. Here comes the word appointed. In these verses 6, 7, and 8, in each of these verses, the word appointed is mentioned. Take note of that. And what is the significance of that word being mentioned in these three verses? It is very important because this word appointed would tell us that God is at work directly in the situation. Plants can grow everywhere. Plants like gourd can grow in that area of Nineveh. It can grow anytime. But this growth of the plant is something extraordinary because it was a direct intervention of God. Now, I want us to take note of this because when you go back to chapter 1, you would see a lot of circumstances or situations, that God also made a direct intervention. For example, when Jonah was sailing on a boat, he was heading to Tarshish. What happened? The text would tell us that God sent a wind. And that wind caused the storm. God wind caused the waves to rise up. And then after that, when Jonah was thrown out of the boat, he was sinking deep into the sea. And what happened? God sent a huge sea creature. So when you notice these words, sent, appointed, these words are saying that God is directly at work in the situation of Jonah. Unlike the God of the deist, I don't know if you're familiar of deism. Deism is a belief that God created everything, and He also created the natural laws to operate in their own system. And then after creating the natural laws after creating everything in it, and every human being and every plant, He left all of His creation to let them operate within their system. So the belief of the deists is that God is not active in the history of His people. God is not actively working in the lives of His children. That's the belief of the deists. But the biblical understanding about it is different. Because when you look at the God of Israel, go to Genesis, He created everything. And after that, He did not leave us. After creating the trees, the sea, the moon, and the stars, after creating human beings, even if He placed the natural law to take their part, He did not leave us, but He continually worked in the lives of His people. So the claim of the deists is not true, but biblically we could see there that God is at work. And this is very evident in the life of Jonah. Because in the beginning, in chapter 1, we could see already those words like He sent. And this time, in chapter 4, these words 3 times were repeatedly mentioned. He appointed in NASB. What were those things that He appointed? He appointed a plant to grow in verse 6. Go to verse 7 and you would find the same word. But God appointed a worm. And then in verse 8, when the sun came up, God appointed a scorching east wind. A wind can blow in any direction at any time. A plant can grow in any place at any time. A worm can appear in any place at any time. But these circumstances that were mentioned here are all appointed by God. Meaning to say, He did a direct intervention because He was at work in the situation of Jonah. That is why I said this is a divine sovereignty at work as a response to a stubborn reaction of His prophet. And what happened next was while Jonah was seated there, it was hot, and then the Lord appointed a plant to grow to cover him. And here Jonah had an extreme change of emotions. Because when you go to in verse 1, of this chapter, you would see that he was angry, he was displeased. And now you look at verse 6, when the plant grew to cover him from the heat of the sun, Jonah was extremely happy. So that's clear in the text. It's mentioned there. Jonah was extremely happy. There was a change of emotions. And that is why when you look at verse 4, when Jonah was so angry, God told him, "Is there a reason for you to be angry?" And then move forward. When he was seated there waiting, the night came. In the evening, God appointed a worm to eat and destroy the plant. So in the morning, when Jonah woke up, the plant was already withered, and the sun was coming up, and God appointed that scorching wind and heat of the sun to come upon him, and he suffered all the more. And what was the response of Jonah? Look at verse 8. The sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint and begged with all his soul to die, saying, "Death is better to me than life." In Visayan, may pagmamatay. That's in Visayan. So you would see here that he was angry again. He was displeased and angry in verse 1. He was extremely happy in verse 6. Now in verse 8, he was again angry. And listen to the question of God to Jonah in verse 9. Then God said to Jonah, "Do you have good reason to be angry about the plant?" Do you have a good reason? the emotions of Jonah swung from one point to the other. Anger and displeasement, now extreme happiness, and now back to anger. And that's a reality about emotions. It changes. That is why when God saw Jonah reacting this way, his question was, do you have a reason to be angry? Because when emotions takes place, it brings us from one experience to another. That is why God is giving him this question, not to scold him, not to reprimand him, but God was giving him the chance to reevaluate what he is going through and what he feels. Because often, when we respond based on our emotion, it's very dangerous. That is why we often tell couples, do not ever make a decision when you are at the height of your anger. Do not ever do silly thing when you are so angry, when you are so depressed. Why? Because when you are driven by your emotions, it can go to something that is very dangerous. And that is why God was telling Jonah here, do you have the reason? Intellectually, you ask yourself, you evaluate your situation. Do you have the reason to be angry? And particularly in verse 9, we'll proceed to the next division of this chapter, a great lesson acquired and learned in a tough situation. In verse 9, he said, do you have the reason to be angry about why this plant withered? In particular. And you know what was the response of Jonah? Maldito kayong response. And he said, I have a good reason to be angry even to death. Maldito yun. I really have the reason to be angry. And here comes the lesson. Look at this, verse 10. Then the Lord said, you had compassion on the plant, for which you did not work and which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. The climax. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know the difference between the right and left hand, as well as many animals? Jonah was upset and angry because the plant that covered him was removed from him and he became he was discomforted by the situation. Earlier, he wished to die because of his disappointment. Now he wished to die because of his discomfort. And he was angry, siguro nang hinayang siya sa tanim because he was benefiting from it. And God told him, you are angry that the plant was withered? And in fact, you did not cause that to grow. I caused that to grow. Do you think you should not be compassionate about the Ninevites? And God is claiming out of that statement that I am the one who caused these people to come to existence. They are part of my creation. I made them. Don't you think I should have the compassion about them? And that is the very point that this book is bringing. A wake-up call to Israel and a wake-up call at the same time to Jonah and a wake-up call to all of us. Look at this. The climax of the book is not on the miraculous redemption performed by God in the life of Jonah. Often, even if randomly you would be asked without hearing this sermon, you would be asked, what do you remember about Jonah? I think about 90%, if not all, would say, he was swallowed by the fish. Right? That's what we recall about him. We had our great adventure kids camp. And they made I saw a child bringing it's like a craft wherein there's a whale and then Jonah was inside it. When you open the mouth of the whale, you would see Jonah, just made up of paper. But that gives us a perception, a common perception that when we think about Jonah, we're thinking about the whale. But in fact, it's not the climax of the story. It is neither on the repentance of the Ninevites, nor on the withheld judgment for Nineveh. But listen to this. but it was on the full display of God's heart for Jonah to see and exemplify His compassion. God wanted Jonah to see and exemplify His compassion, not just perceive, not just understand about it as a concept, because Jonah knew God already as a compassionate one. You go back to verse 2, you would see it there. Jonah said, "You are a compassionate God. You are a gracious God." Jonah related that. He knew that God is compassionate. But what God desired for Jonah this time is he would not just have the concept of compassion in his mind, but he would see it happening in the real sense before his eyes in the city of Nineveh. And as part of it, as an application for him, God wanted Jonah that after seeing the compassion of God being displayed in Nineveh, He wanted him also to have that compassion for Nineveh. The compassion of God at work. Millard Erickson, in his book Christian Theology, page 322, said this: compassion is directly associated with mercy. It is the tenderness of heart toward the needy. God is so compassionate that even if a person committed a mistake already, He does not give His judgment right away, but He gives the person the chance to repent and to realize that what he did was wrong. He's so compassionate. He's a tender-hearted person. But Jonah was facing one of the greatest challenges in his life. So great that even all of us, I think, can relate with this. Listen to this line. The greatest challenge is when you are asked to act compassionately to those who have wronged you greatly. The greatest challenge, I'll repeat, is when you are asked to act compassionately to those who have wronged you greatly. It's easy to show compassion to someone you love. When your son or daughter is in pain, you feel the compassion in your heart that a parent would sometimes even say, "If I can just take the pain from you, I will get it." Parents can relate with to that statement, I believe. When your 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 2-year-old, or even a baby is suffering from ailment, and the doctor needs to put a dextrose, a needle on his hands or even forehead, the parent would feel the compassion and would even tell, "Can I take the pain from my child? Pwede ba na ako na lang ang i-inject? Pwede bang ako na lang ang mag-suffer?" I heard parents negotiating that way before God. Why? Because of the compassion that the parent has. Compassion. It's easy to have compassion when the one who is in need is someone you love. But the greatest challenge is when you are asked to act compassionately to someone who tried to destroy you. It's so hard to act compassionately before someone who maligned you publicly. It's so hard to act with compassion to someone who destroyed your reputation. It's so hard to act with compassion to someone who longed to destroy your family. It's so hard to act with compassion to someone who murdered your loved one or raped your daughter or your sister or your aunt or whoever it may be. It's so hard to act with compassion to someone who gossiped about you. So hard. It's so hard to act with compassion to that someone who caused your termination from your job. So hard. It's so hard to act with compassion. Yung mga kalaban mo sa business na sinisiraan ka. So hard. But this is what God is telling us to do. Compassion without actually choosing the kind of people who will receive it. Jonah had the worst experience in the hands of the Assyrians. And yet here comes God telling him, I want you to be compassionate to them. I want you to be compassionate to them. Because compassion is coming from God and He's giving it to us. We are all recipients of this compassion. Listen to this. Listen to this statement, very brief one. Compassion actually is from God for us. God lets us experience His compassion. Because without it, look at the cross. Without it, Jesus could have not been sent to our midst. Why did God send His Son? He looks at man, human beings like you and me. And when He looked at us, He saw that we are incapable of saving ourselves. He saw that righteousness is something that you and I are not capable of acquiring it. He saw that the broken relationship that you had with God is something like a pie in the sky. A pie in the sky, it's an idiomatic expression that you see the pie but you cannot reach it. You want it but you cannot get it. It's something like a pie in the sky. We want it but we can't get it. So when He looked at us and He saw that we need His intervention, He sent His Son to die on the cross. So without His compassion, you and I would have been already judged long time ago. Think about the worst mistake you ever committed. Think about the worst lie you ever stated. Think about the worst imagination you thought of against a brother or a sister. Think about those things. Will they not be enough for God to release His judgment? I think they are enough. But because God is so compassionate, we are still alive today. And He even calls us His own. Compassion for us. And because we receive the compassion of God, just like Jonah receiving it, God is now giving His compassion to others through us. God desires that we will act with compassion to the people around us, regardless of the affinity of that person to us, regardless of what that person did. Yes, it is difficult, but it is possible. Because in the first place, we became just recipients also of God's compassion. I remember a movie. I think the movie is entitled Grace Card. I tried to look for it, but I cannot find Grace Card. A pastor once preached about forgiveness and willingness to release pain and even willingness to help others who are in need. One time, this father, his house is located just right in front of the road. This father allowed his little boy to play on the ground, his playground, without noticing that the boy already went to the road. Maya-maya, may humaharurot na kotse. It bumped and hit the child. The child was dead on the spot. The owner of the car, instead of going down to help, the owner drove away fastly without taking the responsibility. The father went out of the house, took the child in his arms, and thinking that I am going to kill that man who murdered my child, who killed my child. And so years went on. He never found out who that guy was. One Sunday, he came to the church and worshiped. The pastor distributed cards. The card had written there, Grace Card. And the pastor told them, give this card to that person who hurt you and wronged you the most. So the congregation were dismissed after the service. On the following Sunday, the service went on. after the sermon, the pastor preached about forgiveness from God and how God's love and grace can transform a person's life. After the sermon of the pastor, somebody was asked by the pastor to stand. A new face in the congregation. They knew that he was a new face because the congregation was just small. So the person who was new to them stood in front and gave his testimony how God transformed his life. The testimony was it was a sad story actually. And it climaxed on that moment when he was driving on the road and bumped a little child that he left dead on the ground. After the testimony, the father of the child stood in the midst of the congregation. The members knew that he was wishing to kill the person who killed his child. That time, he was caught in between. What shall I do? And after the testimony was given, he stood, and everybody was looking at him because in his heart he knew that this was the man who was driving that car who killed my child. He moved forward with a very angry face, and the congregation was so worried about it. But when he reached the platform where that man who testified was still standing and wondering what this guy is going to do with him without even knowing him, when he reached the platform, the father got his wallet and got the card that says Grace card, and he gave it to this person. Gave that to this person who killed his child and brought him home to talk further and process about it. At the end of the day, they became friends and are ministering together in the church today. How did that happen? This person felt the compassion despite what this guy did to his child. And that's the same thing. It is the desire of God for all of us to act compassionately to whoever it may be. We are very choosy. That's a reality. We choose people. We are good to those who are good, kind to those who are kind, generous to those who are generous to us. But I think what the Bible is telling us is to be compassionate to anybody, even to those who hurt us and wrong us greatly. With this in our hearts, I am praying that God would move in our lives and move through us so that others may know how compassionate He is. The Lord bless us all, and good morning.